The wire report hit the desk at 2100 hours. It was wet, stained with river mud. The soldier who delivered it was trembling, not from cold, but from what he had just done. He was German, a deserter. He had swum across the Bug River to tell them one thing: the attack begins at 0400. The Soviet commander looked at the man, then at the clock. 7 hours left. He picked up the phone to call the Kremlin. He expected orders to mobilize. Instead, he was told to arrest the messenger and silence the report. How do you defend a border when your own leader calls the warning an act of treason? This is not merely the story of a surprise attack. This is the anatomy of a psychological collapse that nearly destroyed a nation. We are going to trace the final 12 hours before Operation Barbarossa, a period where the evidence of invasion was so overwhelming that German soldiers were practically waving at their Soviet counterparts from across the river. Yet, the orders from Moscow remained unchanged. Do not fire. Do not provoke. Do not believe. In the next few minutes, we will document how a single man's paranoia acted as a force multiplier for the Wehrmacht, allowing 3 million German troops to walk through the front door of the Soviet Union. The warnings were precise. The dates were accurate. The tragedy was preventable. But the order to ignore them came from the very top. The strategic situation on the night of June 21, 1941, was a contradiction in terms. Along a 2,000-kilometer front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Soviet Union had amassed the largest military force in history. Almost 3 million Red Army soldiers stood guard. They were supported by over 10,000 tanks, more than the rest of the world's armies combined. On paper, they were invincible. But an army is only as effective as the orders it receives. And the orders issued by Directive Number 1 were explicit. Then no measure is to be taken that might be construed by the Germans as a provocation. Across the river, the reality was impossible to miss. German engines were revving openly in the twilight. Reconnaissance flights violated Soviet airspace over 500 times in just 3 weeks. The Soviet ambassador in Berlin had even been told by sympathetic German officials to pack his bags. Yet Stalin remained convinced that Hitler would not attack without an ultimatum. That this was all a pressure campaign, a bluff to extract economic concessions. He believed the British were planting false intelligence to drag the USSR into the war. It was a fatal miscalculation. As we explored in our episode Moscow's Darkest Hour, the Red Army would eventually learn to fight back with brutal efficiency. But on this night, they were shackled by their own chain of command. The intelligence piled up. Richard Sorg, the master spy in Tokyo, had sent the exact date. The U.S. State Department had sent warnings. Even the Chinese intelligence service had intercepted the signals. Stalin read them all, and he wrote disinformation in the margins of the reports. He was fighting a war against his own spies. Convinced he knew better than the men on the ground, the final warning came at 22:30 hours. The atmosphere in the Kremlin was thick with cigarette smoke and denial. Defense Commissar Timoshenko and Chief of Staff Zhukov were pacing the office. They had received the report about Alfred Liskow, the German deserter who had swum the Bug River. They pleaded with Stalin to issue a full alert. Stalin walked the length of the room, puffing on his pipe. "What if they sent this deserter to provoke us?" he asked. It was a question rooted in logic, but divorced from reality. Finally, reluctantly, he agreed to send a directive. But it was not a war cry. Directive Number 1 was transmitted to the military districts just before midnight. It warned of a possible surprise attack, but in the same paragraph, ordered troops not to succumb to any provocative actions. It was a bureaucratic paradox. Prepare for war, but do not act like you are at war. The transmission lines were slow. The encryption took time to decode. At the unit level, commanders were left staring at teletype machines that offered riddles instead of orders. Outside, the night was short. It was the summer solstice. The sun would rise early. At the border posts, the silence was heavy. Soviet sentries could hear the metallic clank of tank treads on the other side. They could hear the German pontoon bridges being moved into position. Some commanders, disobeying orders, ordered their men to sleep with their boots on. Others, terrified of being purged for provocation, ordered their artillery pieces to remain covered. The ammunition locked in depots miles to the rear. At 03:15 hours, the debate became irrelevant. The horizon simply ignited. 6,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sound was not a rumble. It was a physical blow that shattered windows 50 kilometers away. It wasn't just the border posts. The Luftwaffe had coordinated their strike with second-perfect precision. Hundreds of Soviet airfields, packed with planes wing to wing like sitting ducks, were engulfed in flames before a single pilot could reach a cockpit. In the first moments, there was no returning fire. There was only confusion. Commanders frantically called headquarters, screaming that they were under attack. The response from the district command, who had barely finished decoding Stalin's previous order, was terrifying. "You are being provoked. Do not fire back." One general on the Western Front shouted into the receiver, "We are being fired upon. People are dying. Is this a provocation?" The line went dead. German special forces, dressed in Red Army uniforms, had cut the communication cables minutes before the barrage began. The Fourth Army, stationed directly in the path of the main German thrust, was effectively blind and deaf. Tank crews ran to their vehicles, only to find they had no fuel shells. The fuel depots were already burning. The ammunition was locked away, and the officers with the keys were dead or missing. It was 3:47 hours. German infantry began crossing the Bug River in rubber boats. They expected resistance. They found slaughter. The Soviet border guards fought with suicidal bravery, men charging machine guns with bayonets, holding fortresses made of crumbling brick. But they were fighting as individuals, not an army. There was no coordination, no air support, no plan. By 0400, the first German tanks were miles inside Soviet territory. The Luftwaffe dominated the sky completely. 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed by noon. Most never left the ground. It was the greatest tactical surprise in military history. And back in the Kremlin, the phone rang. It was Zhukov calling Stalin at his dacha. The dictator had gone to bed, believing his diplomacy had worked. Zhukov reported that German aircraft were bombing Kiev, Minsk, and Sevastopol. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Only heavy breathing. "Did you understand me?" Zhukov asked. Stalin finally spoke. His voice was small. "Come to the Kremlin," he said. The chaos of those first hours is difficult to comprehend. Entire divisions melted away. The command structure didn't just break, it evaporated. Reports that did reach Moscow were dismissed as rumors or panic for most of the morning. General Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, lost contact with his armies within the first hour. He spent the day driving around in a staff car, trying to find his own troops, watching the Luftwaffe pick off his supply columns at will. By evening, the German panzer groups had pierced 40 kilometers deep. By the second day, they were encircling entire armies. The Soviet leadership was paralyzed by the dissonance between their ideology and the facts on the ground. They issued Directive Number 3 later that day, ordering a massive counteroffensive to capture Lublin in Poland. It was madness. They were ordering non-existent armies to capture cities they couldn't even reach, using fuel they didn't have. The commanders who tried to execute these orders sent their tanks into open fields to be slaughtered by German anti-tank guns. The mechanized corps of the Red Army, the force Stalin had built at such great cost, was dismantled piece by piece. The roads to the east were clogged with refugees mixed with retreating soldiers. German pilots described the columns as blocks of ants, strafing them until they ran out of ammunition. The final count for 1941 is a number that defies processing. By the end of the year, the Red Army had suffered over 4 million casualties. 3 million soldiers had been captured in vast encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma. 20,000 tanks were lost. 64% of the Soviet Union's coal production was in German hands. The Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. 4 million men. If you believe their story deserves to be told. Not dramatized, but documented. It's like as how we keep doing this. The prisoners were marched west. Most would not survive the winter. They starved in open-air camps, victims of a war their leadership refused to see coming. The immediate aftermath in the Kremlin was silence. Stalin retreated to his dacha on June 29th. He reportedly believed his generals were coming to arrest him for his failure. When a delegation of the Politburo arrived, he looked at them with fear. He wasn't arrested. They begged him to lead, but the damage was irreversible. The loss of experienced officers, the destruction of pre-war equipment, and the surrender of millions of men. It meant the Soviet Union would have to build a new army from scratch, while fighting for its survival. The Germans, for their part, believed the war was won. General Halder wrote in his diary on July 3rd, "It is not an exaggeration to say that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days." He was wrong. He had underestimated the Soviet capacity for suffering and the depth of their reserves. But he was right about one thing. The Red Army that existed on June 21st had ceased to exist. Wars and Myths exists for one reason: to document what really happened. Not the Hollywood version, not the simplified textbook summary. The decisions, the costs, the men who paid for them. If that matters to you, subscribe. The German advance eventually slowed, bogged down by mud and winter, as we've covered before. But the ghost of June 22nd never left the Soviet consciousness. The question remained: how? How did the largest army in the world get caught sleeping? The answer lay in the nature of the dictatorship itself. Stalin had created a system where bad news was dangerous. Intelligence officers filtered reports to match what the leader wanted to hear. Commanders were terrified of showing initiative. The purge of the military leadership in 1937 had removed independent thinkers and replaced them with yes-men. When the moment of crisis arrived, the system worked exactly as designed. It waited for orders that never came. And when the orders did come, they were based on a fantasy. There is a final, tragic irony to this story. At 2300 hours on June 21st, 1 hour before the invasion, a Soviet freight train crossed the border into German territory. It was loaded with grain, rubber, oil, vital resources demanded by the trade agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The German border guards waved it through with smiles. They knew that in 4 hours, they would be invading the country that had just fed them. Stalin was so committed to appeasing Hitler, so desperate to prove his reliability as a partner, that he was fueling the very tanks that were about to crush his armies. Some of the grain from that train was likely baked into the bread eaten by German soldiers on the march to Moscow. History hits different when it's personal. If this battle, this decision, this moment connects to your family's story, tell us. The comments section is an archive too. The border was quiet again by the winter, but only because the front had moved 600 miles east. The deserter, Alfred Liskow, the man who risked everything to warn his enemies, he was arrested by the NKVD. He was not celebrated as a hero. He was eventually executed, a victim of a system that could not process the truth he carried. The warnings were written in ink. The response was written in blood. The warning had arrived 84 separate times. The 85th was the roar of artillery.